Hello, everyone. On behalf of the law school, I welcome and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Alicia Willett. I'm the acting dean here at the law school, and we're delighted to host today's discussion on Detroit's bankruptcy and what it means to all of us here in Albany and in New York State and beyond. Today's program is co-sponsored by three great Albany institutions: Albany Law School's Government Law Center, the Institute for Financial Market Regulation, which is a joint venture between the law school and the University at Albany, and the Nelson A. Rockefeller Institute of Government. This collaborative effort is a perfect example of the types of partnerships that are possible in the capital region among the many fine institutions that make Albany their home. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, let me welcome our panelists who are seated around here. They'll come up after the keynote. I'm delighted to introduce one of my law school classmates, Kathy Shan, who is the mayor of New York's capital city. And Kathy, Mayor Shan, sorry. Mayor Shan certainly knows about fiscal stress firsthand. And she will provide her unique perspective on the fiscal troubles our local communities face. Albany Law School's own Professor Chung, Christine Chung, will speak as well. Professor Chung is the co-director of the Institute for Financial Market Regulation, and her scholarship and research on the topic of financial stress in municipalities has garnered national attention. She's our local expert. We are also pleased that Donald Boyd and Peter Kiernan, the co-authors of the 2014 Rockefeller Institute report on financing of pensions for state and local public employees, are here to discuss policy implications and options for addressing these major fiscal challenges. It's so important that in these discussions that we keep our communities safe, so we are grateful that Richard Mulvaney, who represents the state troopers, will offer the vital perspective of law enforcement. Finally, we welcome our moderator, David Unkovic, who will share his insights from Pennsylvania's capital city of Harrisburg and his experience as receiver for that distressed municipality. Let me turn now to our keynote speaker. Right now, if you were to take out your phone and Google Detroit today, don't take out your phones, but you could, you hit a series of dire entries. Detroit's horrible decline, the abandoned city of Detroit, 42 staggering photos of abandoned Detroit. It's no secret that life has been difficult for some time in Detroit. But if you modify your search by just one word, to Detroit ravage, the picture gets much rosier. The top hit, an article published 2 days ago in the Detroit Free Press titled, "He Helped Rescue New York." Next up, Detroit. We are incredibly grateful that the former New York Lieutenant Governor Richard Ravitch is here once again. He was here earlier this year delivering an incredibly successful Crawford lecture. And he's here today to share his distinct perspectives as a special advisor to U.S. Bankruptcy Judge Stephen Rhodes during Detroit's Chapter 9 case. He's also taken on a new role as senior advisor to the Financial Review Commission that will oversee Detroit's fiscal decisions for the next decade. It's a huge honor to have you here again, Lieutenant Governor. We admire your passion and your resolve, and we look forward to hearing your always intelligent advice for addressing these urgent problems for the benefit of every city and state's future. I'm happy to welcome the Lieutenant Governor to the podium.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back here, and it's fun to be back in Albany. My greatest memories of Albany were in the 70s and early 80s. Being lieutenant governor is probably not the most exciting job in the world. I did, as a result of that experience, get fascinated with the gimmickry in the New York State's budget process, because having been involved in New York City in the 70s, I knew that the single most important thing we did in 1975 was to require the city to budget in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And the city of New York has never had a fiscal crisis since then, and nor will it, because of that requirement. If every other local government, state, city, school district, county, had followed that principle, that advice, this country would not now be facing the series of insolvencies, fiscal stress, significant, if not dramatic, reductions in education spending and in infrastructure investment that is being faced in practically every jurisdiction in this country. Detroit, for 50 years, Detroit's economy, its physical infrastructure, its social structure has been on a steady decline. And the political system did nothing whatsoever about it. As its population became ultimately less than 10% of the population of the state, and its revenue contribution to the state fisc relatively small, it lost any significant political impact on Michigan politics. And even though there were many Democratic governors as well as Republican governors during that period of time, and the unions always had a reasonable amount of leverage in Michigan politics, nobody ever made any effort to do anything. It was a almost unconscious belief that the dog would ultimately talk, that every problem was temporary, would be rectified by a resurgence of the economy. And it's hard to explain it, except it was not on it was not on very many agendas. Finally, after realizing $18 billion of debt, a city in which a third of the streetlights were broken, half of the buses dysfunctional, the population declining, a fourth of the people not paying their real estate taxes, vacant land, abandoned houses galore, a city in which the starting salary for a police officer was $14,000. They finally got to the point. Oh, I want to add one other thing. A city where the public employee unions never dreamed that a bankruptcy court would ever happen, or that, even more importantly, a bankruptcy court would ever decide that the federal bankruptcy statute preempted the Michigan State Constitution's promise with respect to the payment of pension benefits. So everybody went along on the assumption that something would happen. Well, I have to tell you, I think that's happening all over the country. And I want to share with you, hopefully very briefly, what actually happened in Detroit. The governor realized that there was not the ability to pay the debts, that the risk of social disorder was increasing significantly, and they created legislatively a post called the emergency manager, appointed by the governor, who assumed all the powers of an elected mayor. The emergency manager that the governor selected is a partner in the Jones Day law firm, very able, terrific guy, who within 4 months of being named the boss of Detroit, filed a bankruptcy petition under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. A privilege that exists only for those cities located in 30 of our 50 states, and it is not available to any state itself, nor, I might add, to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which is hopelessly insolvent. The emergency manager realized that he had to deal with bondholders, underwriters, bond insurers, public employee unions, trade creditors, bondholders, and there assembled a group initially of 8 judges on the federal court, not in their capacity as judges, but who functioned as mediators. And then they brought in a number of professors from law schools to assist in the mediation process. And the challenge was to put together a plan of adjustment, i.e. a bankruptcy plan, that would be approved by the court as being feasible. Feasibility was the test under the statute. And I was asked to be the advisor to the bankruptcy judge on the question of feasibility. Well, this group of people, above all the bankruptcy judge, ultimately over a roughly one year period, put together a plan that you can read on the blogs and the municipal bond industry is unhappy with, and other people are grousing about it, and there's one local union that's challenging the judge's decision in court. But that this plan has the universal approval of practically everybody, certainly everybody that counts in the state and the city, is a remarkable achievement. The single biggest issue, and this is not because it's typical, but because it's a fascinating story that I want to share with you, and how our community addressed this problem, was the fact that the art had a very fabulous collection of art in the Detroit Art Museum. But it was not owned, the art was not owned by a 501c3, it was owned by the city itself. And therefore, the emergency manager under the bankruptcy law had arguably an obligation to liquidate that asset for the benefit of all the creditors. The business leadership, which had, frankly, as I understand it, essentially ignored the problems of Detroit for years, recognized, or at least a few of them did, that it was also the responsibility of the bankruptcy process to try to figure out how a city could revive and to let its most valuable cultural asset be sold and disseminated around the country was not consistent with hoping for the revival of the city. So they raised $400 million and conditioned that the state would match it through an appropriation. And that was also a way of, there was an appraisal disputed that said the art's market value was $800 million. The other problem was there were 20,000 retirees who were not eligible for Social Security because, as you know, many states have the right to opt out of Social Security for their public employees, and many do. And the pension fund had been frittered away through malfeasance and a lot of bad things. So these 20,000 people had no income whatsoever to live on. So the $800 million rather, that was paid for the art, the foundations contributed the money to a 501c3. The 501c3 bought the art, and it was part of the bankruptcy plan that $800 million would constitute the corpus of a pension fund, which would provide the employees with some income for the remainder of their lives. So without that grand bargain, this bankruptcy would not have come to an end. And it was an example of how critical moments in our marvelous democratic system, people show up and try to solve serious problems. Having said that, I have to tell you that this is no assurance that Detroit will ultimately be a thriving city. There are exogenous circumstances such as the discretionary budget of the federal government, the state of Michigan's politics and their revenue sharing programs, the state of the economy, interest rates. All of this will affect Detroit's ability to recover. Whether or not people will move back into the city, an open question. Part of it has to do with the creation of jobs. Part of it, the good news is that living there is so cheap, you could buy a 3-bedroom house for under $4,000 in Detroit on an eighth of an acre. So maybe the gentrification process is enhanced by that. I think the mayor is very, very able. The emergency manager is now turning over to the elected mayor the responsibility of running the city. He is desperately trying to recruit talent to help him reverse the trend. One of the people he hired was somebody well known to the Rockefeller Institute and me, and my recommendation, he hired Carol O'Clerican, who had been the finance commissioner in New York, as deputy mayor in Detroit. And she has done work for the Rockefeller Institute over the years. So I make no predictions. I think people of goodwill want to see if it can work out, and I suspect it will be newsworthy for some time. But let me tell you what I hope is an introduction to the discussion you're about to hear, which is the important part of today, that the questions that people are thinking about in Washington, in academia, in the legal profession, is what do we do to a governmental jurisdiction that's insolvent, for which Chapter 9 is not an option? Feasibility, not a defined term. Is the judgment of feasibility under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code mean you're saying that the city will be viable and be able to pay its bills for what period of time? Totally undefined. Feasibility is a very subjective test. The truth is, the real decision is coming out of Chapter 9 better than plunging the city back into endless litigation, the outcomes of which are totally unknown. You have bankruptcies, as I'm sure many of you know, in cities in California. You have insolvencies growing all over the place. And you have many, many cities, including the one that we have the good fortune of sitting in, that's facing enormous fiscal pressure. Not all of them have mayors that are as willing to face up to that as Albany does, but because politics, as usual, is still, unfortunately, very much part of the scene. But there are two things are happening at the same time. Serious people are recognizing that this fiscal stress, the fact that retirement costs and healthcare costs are rising faster than state and local revenues, that education and infrastructure are getting squeezed out. There are 300,000 fewer teachers in the United States of America than there were 10 years ago. We are amortizing more municipal debt in the United States today than we are issuing new debt. And even assuming all of it was issued for capital investment purposes as distinct from covering operating losses, that is a hell of a comment about what a modern industrialized society is going to be like when we're disinvesting in the infrastructure to that extent. Those are the real problems that this society faces. So at the same time that politics is constantly opting to kick the can down the road, there are, as I said, an increasing number of people who are thinking very seriously about how do we address this? How do we address this fundamental conflict that I just described at a time in our history where the best politics seems to be no new taxes? And with no new revenues, it is almost impossible to solve. I'll go further. It is impossible to solve this problem. And that is the political part of this equation. The intellectual challenge is to find out how do we educate the public to know, to understand, and to elect people who will make the decisions that will prevent this dreadful disease of insolvencies and fiscal stress from spreading. How do we stop electing people who think, as I said earlier, that the dog will talk? But it's got to begin with a comprehensive understanding of the seriousness of the problem, that it is not just a function of the economic events of 2008. If 2008 hadn't happened, we'd be in the same trouble we're in today. It might not be as severe in some circumstances, but our pension systems would still, as Don Boyd and Peter Kiernan have pointed out, would still be substantially underfunded. And our upstate cities caught between the mandates that they could do nothing about, the tax cap they could do nothing about, but nonetheless with the same responsibility for their roads and their sewers and their water system, and incapable of dealing with it. These are the problems this society has to conjure with, but it has to begin with a true, genuine understanding of how serious the problem is, and two, with a skill set to communicate that so that that set of facts become the major factor in domestic politics. And there isn't a better place to have that discussion than Albany, because this law school is substantively interested in public problems, and the Rockefeller Institute is the leading institution in the country that attempts to understand the severity of the problem. So, having said all of that, I hope that kicks off a discussion from people who will have an opportunity to explain the seriousness of this to all of you. And I thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. We'll hear more from you before the day is out, I'm sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ray Brescia. I'm a faculty member here and director of the Government Law Center. We're one of the co-hosts of this afternoon's discussion, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to build on the welcome that Dean Willett gave you earlier. When discussing Detroit and the fiscal crisis of New York City and other places, it's not too hard to see that the solution to navigating difficult fiscal times rests in partnerships between government, cultural institutions, nonprofits, investors, the philanthropic community, unions, and that is the appropriate metaphor for this event this afternoon, because it is the power of partnerships that brought this event about. I want to mention two groups of partners that made this possible. First, our sponsors, and then our co-hosts. And I want to acknowledge our sponsors for this afternoon's program. It's their generosity of organizations, of firms, and one individual that have made this event and the reception to follow possible. And so I wish to name them, if I may. It's a long list, but I'll go through it quickly. Albany County Bar Association's Committee on Attorneys in Public Service, the Association of Towns of the State of New York, Brown and Weinraub, Greenberg Traurig, Harris Beach, Hinman Straub, Manat Phelps and Phillips, Matthew Matarazzo in his individual capacity, the New York Municipal Insurance Reciprocal, New York State Association of Counties, Nixon Peabody, Pfizer, Squire Patton Boggs, and last but not least, Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna. Thank you. Now, our institutional co-hosts this afternoon are the glue that has held this program together. My dear colleague, Professor Christine Chung, who we will hear from shortly, is a co-director of the Institute for Financial Market Regulation, a joint project of the Law School and the University of Albany, and one of our co-hosts this afternoon. Through the IFMR, she has been committed, thoughtful, and indefatigable in helping to make today's programming a success. She's also a prolific scholar on the subjects we will touch upon today, and we have made this scholarship available to you as a complement to this program, and you'll see it available right there. A special thanks to Professor Chung and the IFMR for agreeing to co-host this event and for countless hours of behind-the-scenes work that helped make this program possible. Our other co-host today is the Rockefeller Institute of Government at the State University of New York. This is the second event we have co-hosted this year. The first event brought us down to the United Nations, where we talked with international experts. We talked about the subject of modern slavery and human trafficking, and we convened an illuminating, inspired, and inspiring discussion of these topics. Robert Bullock of the Institute has been an able and willing colleague in pulling both of these events together, and it's just been wonderful to partner with the Rockefeller Institute. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to let everyone know that we are not just recording this event, we're also live tweeting it. And you can see our hashtag DetroitNY. You can think about what that means. And if you see me playing with my smartphone, you'll know why. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our moderator, who will then take over the activities. We're delighted that Dave Unkovic took the trip north. He avoided the snow and is here today to share his unique experiences, having served as the municipal receiver for Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. David previously was chief counsel of the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development and worked as a bond attorney at Saul Ewing LLP for 27 years before leaving to be a managing director and chief compliance officer at PFM Asset Management LLC. A graduate of Harvard Law School, he joined McNeese, Wallace, and Nurek in June 2013. You can read his full bio in the program. I'm going to move this back so the panelists can see each other, and then I'm going to step out because I've actually got students taking an exam right now. I'm going to step out for 5 minutes, make sure they're all right, and then come back and join you and start tweeting. So, Dave, it's all yours.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. I may be the only non-New Yorker in the room. I don't know if there are any others. But, you know, a lot of these problems are the same in different states, particularly when you're looking at mid-size and smaller cities. Like Albany and a lot of the cities in New York. It's very similar to the state capital, Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania. But I think you know, the lieutenant governor's speech was very good, and he sort of ended it by saying that you really need to look at the facts before you can figure out what the solutions are. So I think the first part of the dialogue today, and we're not going to have PowerPoints, we're not going to have speeches for 15 minutes from each of us, we're really going to have a discussion here. And if anybody feels strongly, raise your hand and we'll get you in it. But I thought we'd start where you really need to start, which is in the mayor's office of a city. And then we'll move on to the three men on the other table and talk a little bit about pensions, and then go back and forth from there. So, Mayor, would you like to talk about running a city?
Sure. So I've been doing it for a whole 11 months now, so I'm a real pro. But the challenge that is facing Albany is similar to the challenges that are facing other municipalities throughout New York State. I am part of the New York State Conference of Mayors. I'm on the executive committee of the New York State Conference of Mayors. We just met on Sunday as an executive committee and discussed some of the challenges. And for each of the municipalities in New York State, it is somewhat unique because we have even different forms of mayoral government in our cities, much less than what makes up villages and towns and counties. And so the thing that people love is their local government. And so when we talk about consolidation and we think that we can wave this magic wand and if we just consolidated everything, it would all be wonderful and we would all be flush with cash, what gets lost in that is that when you look at the opportunities for municipalities to dissolve, overwhelmingly, they're voted down. I believe there have been 22 propositions and only 7 have elected to dissolve. And we're talking about, villages that had 467 people in them. So, people are used to seeing their local leaders. They, that's really, as mayors like to say, it is where the rubber meets the road. It's an overused term, but, we're the person that gets stopped in the grocery store. And if somebody's got an issue about a tree or a pothole or a great idea for a new program for our youth, or what are we doing about our schools, it is where things are perceived to get done, and it is where things do get done. So, in looking at how we pay for that, it's a challenge because we are dependent more and more on the real property tax to fund it as federal dollars have evaporated. For example, community block grant money gets cut every year. So federal funds that were available, particularly for urban centers, are evaporating as the state cuts back. Understandably, when 2008 hit and there were some real challenges, there were cuts made. But as decisions have been made on that state level to rein in taxes, it all flows down because we still have to put cops on the street. We still have to have firefighters that are, in a firehouse. We still have to plow the roads, fill the potholes, and provide some level of service for people living in our communities. And as we depend more and more on a regressive tax, which that's what the real property tax is, it's challenging. There's been a lot of talk in New York State about the 2% tax cap as a way of reining in real property taxes in New York State. But the reality for a city like Albany and for most upstate cities is we can't raise our property taxes anymore. We're already overtaxing and taxing our way out of economic development because our tax rates are so high. So for a city like Albany, raising property taxes is just going to exacerbate the problem. It's going to make it worse because we are already struggling to get investment. Since the recession ended, the commercial assessed value in the city of Albany, our commercial property tax base, is down 13%. And that is driven in part because our taxes are so high that we're not getting that commercial investment. So, as a mayor, what I would love to do is, hit the reset button. If you talk to any mayor, even mayors who are benefiting from formulas, the formulas that we use to provide aid to municipalities, to provide aid to our school districts, don't make any sense. And the aim has not been increased, but even if you just increase it, if we were to say, let's use surplus that we have this year to increase aim across the board, it doesn't fix the underlying issue. It doesn't fix the fact that for a city like Albany, for example, we get less per capita in aim than Utica. If you look at it from every level, if you look at it from population, from your daytime population, from the number of people living in poverty, the formula doesn't make sense. So having the political will to really address that formula and how we fund our municipalities is a heavy lift. But I would submit that until we're ready to do that, until we're willing to really look at how we provide funding at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level, that it's going to be a real challenge for us to actually get out of this crisis mode that we seem to perpetually be in every year and into a real growth mode and an investment mode for our state.
Is it fair to say that cities are, whenever they're in a bilateral relationship with anybody, workers, the state government, or whatever, are always on the short end in terms of power and the ability to affect the result?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be, we have to own how we use taxpayer dollars and what we do with those dollars. So for the city of Albany, for example, the city has not invested in technology. The last time we purchased a software system was in 1998. 1998. So I look at my taxpayers and I say to them, I can't sit here and tell you that I am being as effective and efficient as I possibly can be with your dollars. When we pay every single employee in the city of Albany on a paper timesheet that we manually type into a system that was purchased in 1998, I know that we're not doing the best that we can. So I think, you know, we have to recognize that there are things that we can be doing at the local level to absolutely be more effective and efficient. But we have to recognize a lot of that is happening already. You know, we're already working with the county. We work with other municipalities because we have to. And that is one of the benefits that I've seen from the crisis that we're in, is that many leaders are taking advantage of that crisis and starting to work together in ways that we haven't in the past. But when it comes to being able to actually make changes to, for example, contracts, mandates where we don't have the flexibility, that has to be part of the conversation around what I'm talking about with respect to how are we funding our cities and our school districts. You know, I speak specifically to the state of New York, and are we willing to revisit how it is that we do that?
Okay. Maybe I could go over to Rich for a second.
The evil one.
Yeah. Let's not talk about pensions yet, but just in terms of how cities operate, how do the employees see how the cities are doing it and how they can help contribute to a solution?
Well, here, you know, pardon my southern accent, by the way. It's Brooklyn, but there's a you know, the big monster in the room obviously is the unions, the evil ones. And I find it interesting, and I appreciate being invited here, by the way, so there is a voice for the employees of Detroit and the employees of New York State and the employees in Albany, that I could speak for them, even with this crazy accent. But unions, as a general sense now, are extremely sophisticated organizations. They're no longer beer halls where people sit and smoke big cigars, which is the general, you know, belief and observations out there, that the big wigs are getting rich, fat with cash, and, you know, squeezing the municipalities. Perhaps one side would view that. On my side, there's been give and take for 60 to 80 years in modern unionism in New York, and more specifically after the invocation of the Taylor Law, which is another thing that's hanging out there in the sphere of labor management relations in New York State. But the modern union, the modern labor union in New York State has grown, it has evolved, it understands the difficulties that are involved in with municipal financing, the fiscal challenges that are out there. As much as you see the public stamping of feet on both sides, there's money to be found. We have evolved into an experienced negotiating organization on any unions that I've dealt with, from Nassau County through state unions. We hire the same economic analysts to go through the bonding rates. We do all of this in preparation for negotiations, and we're fully prepared going into a negotiation to understand what is feasible in developing a mutually accepted contract on both sides. That requires both give back, buy back, and it hurts on both ends, okay? We understand that as labor unions. But going forward, what I've seen is the modern labor union now, more specifically in New York State, understands that you have to be ahead of the wave, the curve. The curve is decimation. The curve is pullback. The curve is the elimination of modern negotiations in a collective bargaining atmosphere throughout the country, okay? We are the last bastion, or one of the last states that truly accepts the ability to collectively bargain in the Northeast. With that said, we have to be prepared in New York State that there's going to be some extreme belt tightening, and we have to think about alternative ways to get productivity levels up that is sufficient to help everybody who lives in the city of Albany, the state of New York, but understand that we also have to make a living. You know, I go to Florida and I represent Florida state troopers, and they put them in the ground just as fast as New York state troopers. They make $33,000 a year. You know, what is the value of a human life? What is the premium on a law enforcement officer either in Detroit, Florida, or New York State? Those are my arguments. What is a teacher who works all the way up to a master's degree plus 50? Is that worth $68,000 a year? These are the harsh truths that we have to realize from the workers' side. Quite frankly, we're living in a society that I see it as highly mobile now. The acceptance of purchasing homes. It's almost frowned upon because of the understanding that the highly mobile society, we don't want to be stuck somewhere in a house for so long, right? The 401k, that great idea from IBM when Big Blue developed it back in the late 70s. One wonderful, wonderful concept, eh? So these are the things that we look at as unions. The whole basket of economics we take into consideration when we sit down at the negotiating table. It is not a beer hall anymore. With that said, we have to go forward and say, what is Mayor Sheehan's interest here? I'm not negotiating for the city of Albany nor for their police departments or municipal employees, but it's the same. The concept is the same. How do we get to a mutually accepted collective bargaining agreement that's not going to bankrupt the city, embarrass it politically, and still survive as employees to provide the best services possible? That's what we try to do.
Okay, thank you. I may throw in a few comments here as we go. One thing that I find interesting, and having been a receiver, is I didn't necessarily view the unions as a union problem. You have employees. Some of them are union employees. Some of them are not. Many of the benefits and the salaries that the non-union employees get is because of what the unions negotiate. But when you look at the problems of labor, which is 70% of your budget and just about every city budget, the people who make the decisions on what the benefits and the salaries are going to be themselves get pensions and themselves are public employees, whether they're in the executive branch or the legislative branch or the judicial branch who make decisions on these cases. And I would just say, you know, I know we're in a democratic state and so forth, but there are large parts of the country that look at this dynamic and say the split isn't union versus non-union. It's people in the private sector having to pay for these defined benefit plans that they don't get themselves. And I think a lot of that, over time, as these cities have problems, are going to inform the discussion and force more reasonable terms for public employees. So,
if I could respond.
Sure, please do.
You know, looking at the idea or the concept that every government should run itself like the modern business, and we should run it like a corporation, you know, in or out, up or down, immediate bottom line acceptance, productivity gains, things of that sort. There's a real dynamic in a municipality, and you'll agree with me, that you can't always run it like a corporation. And quite frankly, corporate decisions that have historically evolved in the last 25 years haven't always been the right idea, okay? And I'm going to say that loosely, but we all understand what the deal is, okay? Municipalities provide two things that are most important: public safety and education. When you go out somewhere that's outside your residence, the two things that you ask yourself is if it's safe to go have dinner in that area. That's the first thing. If you're interested in moving somewhere or relocating, you ask yourself what? How's the education system? The two main qualifiers in any individual who's thinking about moving somewhere or visiting somewhere, not about the, yeah, I understand the art, I understand the culture, but everybody asks, can I get a dinner at the corner if I get off the subway? That's what you're looking at. Do I call it a special interest? Unions are special interests. So are municipalities, so are counties, so are government entities. Everybody's got a special interest. Everybody does. It's a misnomer to say that we're just the individual special interest that attacks everything. The bottom line is, Those things are very important to a municipality. It's not the premier things. The service of protection and education. Everything else falls in behind it. What is the municipality willing to pay for the ultimate service and protection? What is the municipality willing to pay for its top-notch education systems that draw everything else in? Those, to me, are very, very important qualifications.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Chung, what do you think about these issues of where the cities are?
You know, I think a couple of things. I think that, Mayor Sheen is speaking to the structural challenges that face cities. There is an obligation to provide services, right? We rely upon our local governments to provide services by and large. When we look at where local government budgets rest, it's roads, it's schools, it's, local infrastructure and local public health and safety. So we tell them they have to. In fact, we often tell cities how they have to do it through mandates, right? And through contracts, right? This is how it's going to work. But we have to recognize that their sources of revenue for this work are fundamentally constrained, right? So property tax is the major source of local government revenue. And what do you do in a city like Detroit or like many of our upstate cities where you have declining population, a declining industrial base, expanding infrastructure needs, and often expanding human services needs, right? So we're trying to do more with fewer people and lower revenues, and no magic fairy dust of grants or anything like that to take care of the problems. And I think, we have to recognize that fundamental conundrum that our municipalities, our local governments have to deal with. I think, it is important to say, what is a good school system worth? How much are we willing to pay? But I think that there's, we also have to, there's lots of stakeholders, right? All of whom have a moral claim, right? There's the residents of the city who have a right to live in a place where they get at least minimally acceptable services at a rate they can, with an amount of money they can afford, right? And an economic model that's sustainable so people don't flee. I mean, that's the Detroit problem, right? The Detroit problem is we have a small percentage of the population spread out over a huge geographic area, and the city is paying for promises made to workers and others, promises made 20 years ago, right? So we're talking about funding pensions and funding and health care. These are promises that were made in the past that a smaller group of people who are poorer and who need more have to pay. And so in the spirit, I think, of our opening remarks, sort of facing up to this fundamental structural challenge, this revenue challenge, I think is one of the ways that we can try to add to the discussion, because it's a revenue challenge. There is no way that the city can come up with more money, So in a perfect world, all of, taxpayers are entitled to a reasonable tax rate. Public workers are entitled, obviously, to reasonable compensation for the life-saving work that they do. School children are entitled to a school that is safe and good. How do we pay for it? And I think that's what we're seeing. That's where we're seeing the tension. And so, and I don't think that we shouldn't make poorer, needy people pay for promises that they can't afford, just as we shouldn't expect our public workers who relied on their pensions, just, have them evaporate with no consequence. Like, everybody's got a moral claim. There just isn't enough money. And so I think our challenge is to find an economically viable solution that recognizes the reality of constraints on revenue and expanding expenses. Okay,
and then further sort of exploring the facts here, why don't we talk a little bit about pensions and healthcare costs? And let's see, Peter and Dawn, why don't you lead off on that topic? One of you.
Okay. Well, when you talk about how much you're going to pay for good schools or safe neighborhoods, it really matters how you pay. We tend to pay compensation in two ways: wages now and promises of benefits to be paid in the future, whether that's a pension or whether that's retiree health care. It turns out that the system of setting aside money to pay promises in the future has not worked very well as a system. I want to say, by the way, we'll come back to New York distinctions. New York is in some ways much better than many parts of the nation, but you know, it has led to underfunded pensions of about $1 trillion by pension funds' own measures for the U.S. and by $2 to $3 trillion under some more realistic assumptions. So it has, you know, it's a system where it's very easy to underfund, and in fact, in the case of healthcare, we've got, you know, somewhere around $250 million worth of healthcare promises with absolutely no funding, and so it's unabashedly underfunded. And that's you know, one of the problems is when we get down the road, when a government gets into trouble and the money is not there in a fund to pay those benefits, that's when they become fair game for cutting. But again, the system does not encourage kind of full funding. And just lastly, the size of these promises relative to governmental budgets is quite large. And so employee benefit costs, this includes current workers as well as pensions and retiree health care for the upstate cities between 2005 and 13 increased by about 51%, by more than, in dollar terms, property taxes and sales taxes combined. So it's a very substantial part of the budget and a very substantial contributor to governmental stress. I'll stop there for now, but Peter may want to
jump in. Yeah.
Well, in respect of pensions as a general matter first, I think one reason why pensions is a big part of this program is, as Mr. Ravitch mentioned, the Great Recession didn't cause all the problems we're talking about today and didn't cause the pension problem, but it shined a light on it. And I like to say that the Great Recession in respect of pensions can also be called the Great Awakening, because I think because of the things that were revealed by the Great Recession, the stress that was put on governments, people, voters, taxpayers became aware, maybe for the first time, of the impact that pensions and employee benefits were having on the bottom line. And they wanted to see a change. And then they found out it's not so easy to change. I think just briefly, that in the last quarter of the 20th century, defined benefit plans, which are the kinds of pensions we have in government, defined benefit plans virtually disappeared in the private sector. And the reason is that shareholders, which are the analog in the private sector to taxpayers in the public sector, shareholders saw the impact it was having on the companies that they owned, the bottom lines of those companies, and insisted there'd be a change. And it was very easy to achieve with mergers and acquisitions and leveraged buyouts and very easy access to the bankruptcy courts. And the fact that pensions often were a function of collective bargaining, they were able to get rid of defined pension plans and go to what Richie calls the great idea, the 401k, which some labor unions, in the circumstance when there was a labor union, did not necessarily object to, because it promoted mobility. Someone could have a 401k and switch jobs 5 or 6 times, keep the same benefit. If you had a defined benefit and you had to be with a company for a long period of time, and if that company just got sold right out from under you, you lost your pension. But in the public sector, taxpayers began to demand change, and they found out it wasn't so easy to get. And one big reason is that, particularly on the state level, and certainly throughout this state, pensions are a function of political bargaining, not collective bargaining, because pensions are decided by state legislatures. They're a function of laws. And you can't bargain them away at the bargain table. You have to get your hands dirty in the politics and do it in the legislatures. And that's hard to do. It's particularly hard in a state like New York, because People that receive pension benefits are vested and have constitutional protection. They're vested from day one of employment. It was very hard to do in Michigan, although the constitutional proscription there is a little more flexible than it is in New York. It only deals with accrued benefits. But if people didn't want a change in the pension system, they fought it politically, and if they had a lot of political power, they were able to prevent change. Whether they were right or wrong is not the issue here. It's just the fact that they couldn't, change could not be affected so easily. So notwithstanding that, again, speaking generally here, I think 45 out of the 50 states since the Great Recession have tried or have succeeded in passing some form of pension change in their laws. In the most case, it's for new employees, because in political bargaining, when you're dealing with new employees, the one thing you have to recognize is they're invisible. Nobody knows their name. They have no political power. And so it's easy to change benefits for future employees. The problem is, if you're the mayor of Albany or the mayor of Troy, you're not going to see the benefits for that for at least a couple generations, maybe 30 years hence. So because people became so aware of pensions, we're beginning to focus on it, and then we suddenly realize the impact it's having on government budgets. It's particularly germane to cities, because cities, the biggest component is personnel costs. And of course that means pensions and health care benefits. It's much more of a serious problem in cities than it is in states. Although I learned a long time ago you can't cherry pick the data, and it's not necessarily so that pensions are going to break cities' backs, because it's not unusual that they would have their largest expenditure on personnel costs. One last thing I do want to say about pensions. People that receive a pension, as David, as you point out, that's the people that make the laws, the people that execute the laws, and the people that are affected by the laws, and work for government. They're promised pension benefits, but they are not promised the funding of those pensions. And one thing that pensions, no matter if you're in Oklahoma or New York or Michigan or California, pensions do reveal something about political nature. Dick talks frequently about kicking the can down the road, but it reveals the fact that people in government, elected officials, necessarily think short term. They don't govern in the long term, they govern in the short term. But the downside of that is they tend to look for easy fixes, and there are not many of those. I'm not arguing that there are. But they tend to look for short-term solutions, and pensions are a very long-term problem. And so you tend to put it off, and that's why you get underfunding, which is, and large, full-scale funding is not promised. Sometimes it's required by courts, but otherwise it's not promised. So pensions tend to get underfunded, and then you reach a point, like arguably it was reached in Detroit, that maybe have been reached in Illinois and Chicago and lots of cities in Pennsylvania, where a bridge too far has been built.
And Peter, that's a good segue, because we've talked now about the facts. So we've talked about running the city and the real challenges of making your income statement or your balance sheet, as if you were a business, work. And also the challenges of paying for public employee rights, pensions, salaries, and so forth. I thought we'd look a little bit at what happened in Detroit and then come back and talk about how that could have an impact on how things might develop in New York. And but before we go there, did you have anything to say on pensions, Mayor, before we go into that?
You know, I don't think this is about, for me anyway, whether we should provide pensions. And it goes, though, to, and again, this is for a city. So And I think that the challenges in upstate New York are concentrated in our cities, and it's because you can get into and out of our cities. In New York State, we don't have the ability to annex. So many cities have annexed their way to a broader tax base, and that is not an option that's available to cities like Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. So instead, we have people who locate just outside our cities and commute into our cities to work, such that our populations almost double every day. We have which creates a large infrastructure that we have to support. And the reality is that some of the poorest census tracts in our regions are located in our cities. And so when we talk about what a teacher should earn or what a police officer should earn, that's not a productive conversation. We have the highest paid teachers in the city of Albany, and fewer than 50% of our children are graduating from high school. So it's not that money follows quality. The challenges that we have in our urban centers are expensive challenges, and they require significant resources. And so if we continue in this loop of a conversation around, what labor deserves and what management can pay, I think where we can be more productive is if we work together to say, these are the challenges facing our cities, how are we going to fund it? Because we can't keep asking the people who live in the poorest census tracts to support the system that we've created and meet the needs that we need to meet. It's counterproductive because it gets lost in the noise when you start to look at what's happening in our urban centers, the violence, the crime rates, all driven by poverty. And so, we've got to, I think, sort of change the dialogue and try to figure out how we're going to have this conversation in the context that our state has changed and cities that were once the centers of wealth are no longer the centers of wealth. And so how are we going to fund the needs of our cities going forward and still meet the pension obligations and the promises that have been made and pay a just wage to the people who are doing incredible work. A police officer working in the city of Albany should not make less than a police officer working arguably in, Loudonville, a wealthy suburb that has none of the same social and other issues that we're facing here.
Well, when you have the challenges you have, eventually, particularly if you make poor decisions, you get into real bad situations. So when I was receiver in Harrisburg in March of 2012, I had a decision. I could either pay the workers, because it was a 3 payday month, or I could pay the general obligation bonds. It had gotten that bad. When you have a distressed municipality, first they do things with the income statement, which make it not work. And then they play games with the assets, and they might do interest rate swaps and all kinds of gizmos with the bond market until their balance sheet is screwed up. And eventually, when things get bad enough, literally people won't loan them money. They can't even get a loan from the local bank to get them through their cash flow during the year. And then once the cash flow hits, then, chaos is going to ensue. So for me, it was not a hard decision. And everybody who's had that decision makes the same decision. You pay the workers, right? So the police are on the streets and the firemen are putting out fires and people aren't dying. And you tell the bondholders they're not going to get paid. And so I did that because literally that's where the cash flow was. But also I knew from a cash flow basis through the rest of the year, I couldn't make it through the rest of the year without not paying the general obligation bonds. They were also insured, which was good. So the insurance company did pick up the payments, and they just became another creditor of the city. But it got the city through a workout plan. They needed, a year or two to get through that process, and the bondholders weren't paid during that period. But I was wondering if Professor Chung, can you talk a little bit about what was decided in the Detroit bankruptcy, and then we can talk about how that affects New York. And in particular, there were decisions about constitutional protections of pensions there and also in California.
Yeah. So more than half of Detroit's $18 billion debt involves the cost of public employment and in particular pensions. So if we're talking about sort of pension-related obligations or funky securities entered into to deal with pension-related debt. right? So there were derivatives in the Detroit context, interest rate swaps. There were, if we look at the $18 billion, more than half of it really concerned public employment-related costs. So a key issue at a very early stage in the Detroit bankruptcy was really, were accrued pension benefits subject to being impaired or adjusted in bankruptcy? Meaning, could the bankruptcy court oversee a process whereby accrued pension benefits were cut? And I want to make a distinction here between pension and health care, because health care benefits are much more likely, or it's easier, if you will, to impair health care through a Chapter 9 process versus the pension benefits, okay? So I'm now just talking about pension benefits. So when the emergency manager, even before the bankruptcy filing, kind of went to the various creditors, including the public employee unions and so forth, and said, hey, we think for the city to be viable, everyone's going to have to share in this pain, including accrued pension benefits. And public employees and various constituencies challenged the city's eligibility to declare bankruptcy. And essentially the legal issue was this. The public employee union said, you can't declare bankruptcy, Detroit, unless you agree that pensions are off the table. You must ring fence them or otherwise protect them from impairment, or else you can't declare bankruptcy. And Chapter 9, the municipal bankruptcy chapter, is very different from the sort of regular bankruptcy, if you will, individual or entity bankruptcy. You have to be eligible to be a Chapter 9 debtor, and there are a number of eligibility criteria. Including permission from the state, you have to be insolvent, there's criteria. So at the very early stages, the public employee constituency said that Detroit wasn't eligible because the governor hadn't protected pensions from the possibility of impairment. So that was the legal issue teed up. At the eligibility stage, could the city enter into bankruptcy if it did not protect the pensions? So that was one of the early legal issues discussed in the case. And ultimately, after exhaustive hearings over many days, which you can listen to online, everything was recorded, you can listen to the hearings, several days of hearings, Judge Rhodes held that accrued pension benefits were subject to impairment. That doesn't mean that they would be. Right? That happens, if at all, at the plan stage. This was at a very early stage, and Judge Rhodes held that pension benefits, accrued pension benefits, were subject to impairment in a Chapter 9 proceeding. He essentially said they're contracts between the municipality and its public workforce, and what happens in bankruptcy, contracts are impaired, meaning adjusted, meaning you take a haircut, right? So he said as a matter of law, as a legal matter, that pensions were subject to impairment, okay? Now, he was very clear that he was not going to let the city solve its problems on the backs of public workers alone. There's a lot in that opinion. It's over 100 pages where he made it clear that this wasn't free reign for Detroit or the state or anyone to think that, everyone's pensions would get zeroed out and nobody would take a hit, okay? So it's not licensed. It wasn't licensed to ignore the promises that were made, but he said that they were subject to impairment. And I think, we can talk about whether that, the risk of Chapter 9 in New York or what that might mean for New York. And I'm just going to suggest to you that I think that there was a legal basis for Judge Rhodes' opinion, but I think there might have been a pragmatic motivation too. Because, bankruptcy court, it's rough justice. It's a lot of sausage making. Deals get made and pain is shared. And I think if he had said that pensions were off the table, that would have taken more than half of Detroit's debt off the table. And the city's not going to solve its problems if more than half of its debt is untouchable as a practical matter. So I think there was both a legal basis and perhaps a practical motivation to say, you all have to come to the table. You all have to be part of the solution. I'm not going to let you disadvantage any one constituency above all others, but if you don't all come to the table, the city will die. And that really was a battle for the survival of the city. So that was the legal issue.
Right.
And that set the table for the sort of conversations that can then happen that the Lieutenant Governor alluded to, respecting coming up with a feasible plan for the survival of the city.
Okay, and we'll talk about that. But before we do, Rich, do you have did union people have a reaction to that holding by Judge Rhodes in Detroit?
You know, I've spoken with several major labor lawyers regarding this, and it's sort of interesting. At first blush, people were highly offended, disgusted. You know, the fight was taken out of the unions, if you will, in the initial ruling.
Yep.
What's interesting about Judge Rhodes, and most likely Dick at his side, was the recognition that even though he considered them, or pension, the obligation of pension, the people who were receiving retirement benefits, there was a recognition by the court that they do stand in line above those of other creditors. And you know, if I argue, and we can argue all day of whether in fact they're considered unsecured creditors, or whether Judge Rhodes basically took away the takings argument and things of that sort, you know, the constitutional arguments on taking and the property rights and things of that to pensions. In the end, I think, like you said, he made sausage, but I have to admit that he split the baby fairly well. Now, with that said, the retirees were screwed, okay? The clawback provision was a screwing. There's a lot of things involved in the sausage that don't taste well, okay? So given the context that Judge Rhodes made this decision that said, yes, in fact, it's in play, they are in play, everybody's got an obligation to take a bite out of this sandwich. I understand what he did. I don't agree with it, right? But he did do it. And in his overall making of the cake, if you will, it's not so bad. It didn't come out half as bad as we all thought it would be.
Well, he's a good judge. And, you know, I work as a bond lawyer, so, you know, I have bond people tell me that they were just outraged by what happened in Detroit because the workers did get hacked to a certain extent.
Tough break,
but they were unsecured creditors was his basic holding. Right. But other unsecured creditors that owned bonds, some of which were full general obligation bonds, some were limited obligation, they had different levels of words attached to them, but they got much less than the pensioners did. And, you know, if you look at the bankruptcies in Rhode Island, for example, there the legislature did the opposite. They put in the state constitution that they're going to protect debt service payments, right. And that comes before everything else. And so those are the two big powerhouses when you have this sort of workout. You've got the unions for the public employees and all their interests, and you've got the bondholders. And then you've got some vendors and stuff, but those are the two big polar opposites. And when in Harrisburg, we didn't go into Chapter 9, although City Council tried to file and it got thrown out, but as a receiver, when I sat down with the unions and the bond creditors, the very first sentence I would say was, I am going to file Chapter 9 bankruptcy as soon as the legislature lets me, unless you're willing to give. And the unions, you know, unlike a normal union negotiation where you sort of fight each other until the actual deadline and then settle, it was, you know, I don't care what you give up, pensions, healthcare, whatever, I need X millions of dollars a year. And you figure out whether you're the police, fire, or ask me what you are comfortable putting on the table. And then we'll talk about it. And that process actually worked very well. And the same thing with the bondholders. And you know, of the two, on the whole, the bondholders were the more intransigent group. And eventually, the legislature did a 180 and allowed Chapter 9. And it required one of the governor's cabinet secretaries to sign off on it, so the city couldn't just do it. But that changed the dynamics. Up to that point, the negotiations weren't moving. But once that happened, you know, the unions were not anxious to go into Chapter 9, and the bond creditors weren't either. So eventually the deal got done. But with some of the bond creditors, literally, they had to sign the papers saying, we're ready to file Chapter 9. Here are all the paperwork. Do you want us to file or not? Before, you know, some of those creditors would back off. But I don't know, Peter, if you want to talk a little bit about Chapter 9 and Detroit and how that might play out or have relevance to New York.
Well, I'd say three things, I think. First, in Detroit, I think, Richie, you and your colleagues can say, well, we didn't do too bad. We mitigated the worst. But there's a reason for that. I mean, the bondholders did a lot worse in Detroit than the labor unions did. for the pensioners, I should say. But in Detroit, in respect of the saving the art that Dick talked about, there was a lot of private money that came in that got redirected to the pension systems. I think there was something on the order of $625 million, and I could be wrong by $100 million or so, of foundation money that came in as part of a deal, so-called the grand bargain that some of you may have read about or know about well. But this grand bargain was made to save the art, caused the pension system to stand down because private money came in under the condition that it went directly to the pension system. So the pension systems agreed not to sue. So on its face, it looks like the bondholders took a big beating and the unions only took a slight one. You know, if you have an $18,000 pension, any diminution of that is, in your view, is not a small beating, but relatively speaking in macro terms, the unions did better. But it wasn't the city's money, so when the judge had to decide if it was fair to the creditors, in terms of the city's money, it was fair, because very little of that was city money that saved the pension systems. Now, that's one thing I wanted to say. In respect of Chapter 9, obviously there was the biggest one in the world occurred in Detroit. And there never has been one in New York in terms of a municipality. There's been the New York City OTB, which was owned by the state of New York, went into Chapter 9, and the Nassau County OTB, I think it's Nassau or Suffolk, has gone into Chapter 9. But those were done by executive order of the governor, and they're not municipalities. They were deemed to be political subdivisions, but they were not municipalities. No city in this state ever has gone into a Chapter 9, and even though the local finance law gives them that permission, it's one of those states that allows it. We're one of those states that allows it. But in my view, it's never going to happen in New York. And that could be a long speech, but I would just, a bullet point to that is it's just not the culture of New York. We prefer solutions that put a premium on political accountability. The closest we've ever come to a city filing bankruptcy was in 1975, when New York City was insolvent, had many of the attributes or disadvantages that Detroit manifested: declining population, declining revenue base. That was before personal computers, so everything was being done by hand. A bureaucracy that was struggling to deal with change, a changing economic circumstance. But in the end, New York did not file for bankruptcy. And the state formed the Emergency Financial Control Board, a model that has been replicated several times now in our state, and provided a forum for negotiation. And now the specter of Chapter 9 hung over everybody, but you had the governor immersing himself by becoming chairman of the control board, immersing himself in the local problem, taking the political risk that he would be blamed. The mayor was on the control board. He ultimately did take the political hit, but he also took a political risk. So did the elected city controller and the elected state controller, all of whom had political constituencies. But they got involved in a local situation, and that has been replicated several times. So I said I was going to say 3 things, but 2's enough, I think. Okay.
And Dawn, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a Detroit situation where they have a city pension plan and New York State, where municipal employees are in a state plan, and how that affects how you deal with distress?
Sure. Well, first of all, so first of all, we have a system where the local governments in New York, outside of the city, contribute to the state-run plan, and they have to contribute to the state-run plan. There's a gimmick that's called an amortization, that was a borrowing that allowed them to shirk some of that and push it off to the future. But by and large, they have to contribute. So they're setting aside that kind of borrowing New York, its fund has been relatively well-funded. There certainly has its own issues, but relatively well-funded. What it does is it shifts stress from the pension system, where a lot of pension systems around the country have been terribly stressed, including, of course, in Detroit, to the local governments that must absolutely make those contributions. So, for example, ERS, Employee Retirement System contribution, the contribution rate essentially tripled over the course of this most recent crisis. So that's good for the pension system and, presumably good for pensioners, but bad for the local government. So that's, I think, one important issue. I guess another, and, it's a legal issue, so I'll stay away from it, but if you ever did get into a bankruptcy type situation, I think you have a whole different question about, even if you could impair pension benefits, what does that mean about whether the contribution itself can be cut back and who would pay for it then? But I'll stay away from that unless somebody else wants to deal with it.
Well, there have been some developments on that very point in Stockton and San Bernardino in the last year. Christine, do you want to talk for a minute about that?
Yeah, just very briefly. So California has a CalPERS, the California system, and both Stockton and San Bernardino went into Chapter 9. And just earlier this month, I want to say, in Stockton, the court essentially discussed whether the city could not make its contribution. The city could get out of its agreement with CalPERS or in some fashion not make the contribution. And I have to say the judge gave the city a pretty big stick.
It was dictum. It wasn't actually in front of him to decide. He just said it.
He just sort of went off and said it, and then the city has been reluctant, I would say, to sort of
Yeah, they did not pick up on that, and they went through with a plan that didn't have it in it.
But there was conversation in both of those cases about whether the city could, not make, whether through Chapter 9, the city might be able to get some relief from the contribution required. Because, with these defined benefit plans, the employer makes a contribution, the workers make a contribution, right? And then there's investment returns from the investment of the pooled funds. So the question in these cases was, could the employer, meaning the cities of Stockton and San Bernardino, not make the contribution? And was CalPERS going to take some kind of a cut through this? So, we were talking earlier before this panel about, is there a cost to Chapter 9 not being on the table in New York in the same way that it was in Central Falls and California and Michigan? And also, would a New York municipality ever sort of say, hey, I'm not making the contribution? Those are some of the issues that this raises. But it is interesting in California that this contribution is that issue in the bankruptcy.
Before we go there are green cards. If you have questions, Ray's going to pick them up. So there's one up there already. And so we'll take questions in just a minute, okay?
Could I say something
Peter,
about
go ahead.
Stockton and San Bernardino and Detroit? In each case, particularly San Bernardino, or maybe it was Judge Klein that was Stockton, and Judge Rhodes in Detroit said the pension system is a pension or pension beneficiaries, or in California, the pension system is a general creditor.
Unsecured
general creditor. But San Bernardino and Stockton decided they were not going to try to impair pensions, but they did severely cut health care. In fact, every city, there's only been like 6 major issuers of debt in the history of Chapter 9 that have ever really gone into bankruptcy. Only 6. And most Chapter 9s are dismissed. But of the 6 that issued debt, those of us who watched this thought, well, it's going to be like the World Series. We're going to see the bondholders and the pension holders face off. And it was an enticing prospect, but then it didn't happen because San Bernardino and Stockton backed away from it. And in Detroit, as I said, you got private money. If there had been that private money, then the pensioners might really have been screwed. But so it didn't happen, and nothing is going up to an appellate court. Now, in New York, if a city were to go into bankruptcy, which I don't think will ever happen, and we could have a Great Depression, of course, and then who knows what would happen. But if New York City were to go into bankruptcy, and therefore stop making its payment to the common retirement fund, the common retirement fund, that's a legal obligation. The common retirement fund might sue them. And then I think the issue would be presented in a New York bankruptcy court, just like it was in California, is the state-administered system. Because we have a unified state system with the exception of New York, which has its own, New York City, which has its own system. Common retirement fund, would it be found to be a general unsecured creditor? We don't know. I mean, bankruptcy remains a venture into the unknown.
Right.
The World Series didn't happen. We don't have any guidance. So that could happen in New York.
Let me try to push the conversation just for a second, which is, let's assume that you do have a New York City, a city in New York that's sucking air and going down, right, for whatever reason. And I mean, my own pessimistic view of municipal finance is that there will be cities in this state that do that, and more in Pennsylvania and elsewhere that are going to have real problems. And you get to decision points where you've got to fix the problem. It's no longer tweaking the pension or paying vendors late and so forth. It's really the bad situation. How in New York will you deal with that problem? And you said Chapter 9's off the table, but I think if you get a city in real trouble, Chapter 9 is going to be up front in New York like it is everywhere else potentially. But any thoughts on that? Connie, do you? Or Christine?
I think an interesting question is sort of what is the consequence in the short term of Chapter 9 not being on the table? I'm thinking about, so we have the control board mechanism, which has been used in New York. We also have the FRB, right, that New York municipalities, some have participated in, and I would absolutely want to hear Mayor Sheen's experience. I think there's not a lot of slack in the budget, and I sort of, the lawyer/litigator in me says, deals get done on the courthouse steps. I think that there's a cost for Chapter 9 perhaps not being as politically available in New York. So maybe thus far we've been able to deal with problems through the political accountability mechanism that was described. But I think we have to ask ourselves is if a municipality can't get a reset through Chapter 9 for political reasons, does that restrict your toolkit in ways? I mean, nobody's rushing into Chapter 9. I mean, it's not a good day, right, when the municipality is debating whether to, an insolvent municipality is trying to get into Chapter 9. But it does provide a reset mechanism that is potentially powerful. So I'm wondering, that's sort of my reaction. I mean, there's a cost to not having that stick, and I'm wondering, without wanting you to,
No, well, but I guess when I look at Chapter 9, I'm not sure how much of a reset button it really gives the municipalities, because the challenge that we're facing is a revenue problem. Right. So, if you were to say that you were going to look at the debt of the city of Albany, and right now it's about 13% of our budget because we borrowed to expand our landfill, and so we have this debt. It's matching the revenue of the landfill, but it's still, pretty significant portion of our debt service. And you don't change the underlying cost structure of the city, where 50% of our personnel costs, I mean, if you look at our payroll, we're now at the point where it's 1.5. It used to be that you'd figure 30% for benefits. Well, I remember the day when it was 20, 25, 30. Now it's over 50% of what we're paying people. We have to build in that 50% cost for the expense of health care and our pensions. And it's just what it costs. So, you look at what we've done for new employees in the new Tier 6, and, we see it. I can see what's happening as that number grows, and that it is ultimately going to reduce our pension costs. But currently, this is our cost. So if you don't change it, then I'm not sure what you accomplish by resetting it in bankruptcy. It could force some issues around contracts. So we currently have a large number of public employees who work for the city of Albany who contribute nothing towards health care. And, then we have other employees who are contributing and arguably making less money. So, yes, you might be able to change that, but that's really kind of just skirting around the edges of it. It's all in, maybe a couple $1,000,000. So, you know, there's this structural issue of how we fund our cities and what our expectations are that cities do. And so I don't know how much of a reset button, you know, maybe Chapter 9 puts some urgency around the rest of the conversation, but there's a whole rest of the conversation that has to occur, because I don't think that we should be doing it on the backs of any one group. And when I look, for example, at our union contracts, you know, there's nothing in our firefighters contract or in our police contract that you point to and say, oh my gosh, you know, I can't believe X, Y, Z. There's some things I'd like to change. I'd like to change the sick bank that our firefighters are able to accrue and get paid out, and have a different way of allocating those funds. I would like for everybody to be contributing to their health care, because I think we become better consumers of health care if we have, you know, some skin in the game. So not as an onerous thing to be putting on our employees, but as a way of us working together moving forward. But you know, really looking at all of the different things that we have in front of us, that's it. It would be, you know, going in and saying we're going to hit the reset button on our union contracts, and I would submit to you that's not enough. There needs to be a broader conversation in this state, and probably in other states, about fairness, about how we fund and how we pay for the services that we've come to expect in the state.
That's great. Okay, we have some great questions from the audience, so I'm going to read some questions, and then I'll call on one of you to answer first, okay? The first one, this is sort of a global one. What effect would a national health care plan, i.e. single payer or Medicare for all, have on local finances and property taxes? And let's see, Dawn, why don't you tackle that one? That's a think tank type of question.
All right, well, of course, the key phrase in healthcare reform is always bending the cost curve. What is driving the retiree healthcare cost, the presumed retiree healthcare costs, is two things: an aging of the population, and more retirees, about which I don't think anybody has any plans to do something, and expectations of rapid growth in kind of healthcare costs per consumer, per retiree. If you look at the actuarial evaluations, they usually assume about 5 years of growth at 10% a year, and then maybe falling down to 5%. Thankfully, those kind of assumptions have been recently getting proved sort of wrong. If there were a single payer, and if they could truly bend the cost curve, meaning slow the rate of growth in healthcare costs, that would have a significant impact on, certainly on both retiree healthcare and employee healthcare costs, as well as for the state governments on Medicaid, which would help state taxpayers in most places. So.
Good answer. Okay. Next question. Isn't it correct? This is addressed to me, but Rich, I'm going to let you answer this one first. Isn't it correct that a bond is essentially an investment subject to investment risk, whereas a pension is simply compensation for services rendered and should not be subject to investment risk?
The ultimate question. Right? Isn't that a great question? I thought about this for many, many days as we were just preparing for this, and it was also addressed in the amicus briefs that were applied. That is the ultimate question. Why are employees who worked and toiled, yada, 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 going into the social implication of why are they placed as a creditor, period? There was a constitutional argument that this was in fact a property right that was taken unilaterally through Chapter 9, and why are they victims of a creditor default, if you will, when they weren't creditors to begin with? There was not just although Judge Rhodes specifically said, you know, I'm going to accept this as a contract. Quite frankly, the toil and effort that's put in for some 30 years as an employee with one employer certainly cuts a hell of a lot deeper than just a creditor's right, if you will. And I do agree. A creditor is a bet. If you place a bond, you are betting through due diligence that, in fact, your outcome will derive some sort of benefit, if you will, based on the investment. An employee, on the other hand, is promised through an incentive. If you work for me for some 30 years, the benefit derived will be an acceptable rate for you based on your effort, based on other issues, obviously, but never thought about in the overall scheme of you're a creditor coming in when I hire you, and if this whole thing goes bad during the 30 years, you're screwed just like everybody else who invested in our city. That's a problem, okay? I do think it's a problem. I don't understand, to this day, I still don't understand how, I do understand how Judge Rhodes did it, but I don't accept it. There's a human side of this, there's a sociological side of this, and he's trying to put this together, and I give him credit where credit is due. I really do. I mean, the judge said, listen, I'm going to place them in this pocket of creditors, whether they're unsecured or not. I accept the sociological impact of an employee being affected by this, and I'm going to give them a little bit of a play. Stockton is a little bit different, and Peter explains that, quite frankly. The dynamic and the rules are changing. The playing field changes as you go west. In New York, I agree with Peter. Peter came out and historically, you know, good or bad, Governor Patterson did not sign the Tier 2 extender. We were forced to renegotiate alternative pension plans. The whole concept in New York, and I think Peter hits on it, is that we're not like Michigan and we're not like California. We see the problems ahead of time, and Mayor Sheehan says it quite succinctly. The municipalities are the ones left holding the bag right now. And politically, do they have do they have enough skin to come in and influence state government to change the dynamics, the paradigm, if you will, on how money is allotted, where the sources of revenue are coming in? There's also a social responsibility for towns and villages and municipalities to redefine themselves. Should this be a natural skinning, if you will, in Detroit, like every other, historically towns and villages in the gold rush? I mean, I looked at it and I said to myself, wait a minute, Chapter 9, wait a minute, why shouldn't this city just sort of melt down, if you will, if it can no longer support itself? Isn't this a natural progression in the United States that towns and villages build up and disappear because of whatever, economic conditions, sociological conditions, demographic changes? This is not the first time that municipalities have had this type of, is it too big to fail? Is Detroit too big to fail? I don't know. I don't know. These are all types of things that we think about.
Can I play devil's advocate on this issue? And I don't believe everything I'm about to say, but one thing is, bondholders are people too. And a lot of bonds leading up to the meltdown in 2008 were insured. If you look in the bond market now, very few bonds are insured, probably less than 10%. So in some ways, these workouts, including in Harrisburg, were lucky that you had bond insurers there because you knew they could take the hit as a major creditor. But a lot of people invest their own pension monies in funds that are not insured or not necessarily insured. And so when you have this sort of meltdown, it's not just, you know, employees are individuals, and then you've got these big financial firms over here, and they're obviously easier to hit. But you also have individuals. So for example, if Puerto Rico goes down, they're for various tax reasons, their bonds are in funds all across the country, in every state, and that would be a major disaster for people's pension monies around the country, particularly in 401ks. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is, and this is more political, that you know, the unions are very powerful in the public sector. No state senator wants to go against the FOP, whether they're Republican or Democrat or whatever. They're very wary of doing it. So I think, although, you know, workers have negotiated for terms and stuff, I think people in the private sector say they got better deals than you would get in the private sector equivalent, just because they're tied in politically and make contributions to these people who get elected and make the decisions. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, you know, bondholders took a risk and employees, they just worked hard and deserve what they get. It's not quite that simple. So. Well,
and I think, you know, to that point, when you look particularly at New York State and at the pensions, you know, a business has a good year and they might give everybody a nice big bonus, but it's a one-time, you know, cash bonus that you're going to get, and everybody's happy. But in New York State, when times were good, and the unions went to the state and said, we want to sweeten these pensions, right? If you were a tier 3 or a tier 4, I think initially you were supposed to contribute 3%, for your entire career. Well, that got changed. So then it was only for 10 years. And so these changes that were made and the changes in the calculations about how the pensions were paid out were enhancements. That came, sort of after employment started. You were already in this tier and you got a better deal. And the person who has to pay the bill are the mayors and the towns and the villages and the municipalities. So, we didn't have any say over that. We're just paying the bill for it. And so when you look at what happened, our pension expenses went up over 100%. Over the course of, following 2008 and 2009, they're starting to level off and come down a little bit, but because, of course, we didn't have any money and we decided to amortize our actual expense, because now we're paying for borrowing to cover this operating expense, we're going to be paying for this for a really long time, and a lot of it is attributable to enhancements that were made after a person already entered into a certain tier. And I think that is the one thing that is different about government than in the business world, because you have these political opportunities when times are good to go in and to negotiate for these enhancements. And now we're all sort of, having the stomach ache from like gorging out on all our Halloween candy. It's a challenge. And, when I talk with our unions, I talk about making sure that, we need to save where we can so that we can spend where we need to. The 2015 budget that we adopted assumes that nobody gets a raise at all. And we last settled union contracts in 2010. Now, and this is a 2015 budget. Some of our contracts are settled through 2012, but I don't think that's right either. But we don't have the money to pay for it. And when 50%, when you look at what we're spending, our payroll is about $84 million. 18 million. Then we pay 18 million for pensions, and then another 25 million for health insurance. And that doesn't even include FICA. So where do we go? Right? How do we get ourselves onto a sustainable path? And so I'm not necessarily saying that you change these tier 3s and tier 4s, but I do think that there needs to be an honest conversation around the fact that some of this cost is driven by changes that were made after that employee started that job.
Go ahead, Peter.
One sentence on this issue, whether it's a risk that should be equated to a bondholder's risk. Pension is a deferred compensation. So you're talking about people's wages. I don't think this is another sentence, when someone joins a pension, becomes an employee, they're not given a prospectus. They're not told to examine the risks of the government going belly up. They just take a job and they do it, and they get the pension is promised to them as deferred compensation, wages for work performed. So I have a lot of sympathy for the argument that it's not the same kind of a debt. Now, if someone were to go to work in San Bernardino after they've already filed for bankruptcy, maybe you could say that they're on notice that they're taking a risk.
Okay.
But that's not a common occurrence.
Okay, thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Just a tiny bit of devil's advocate with, tiny bit, right? I think it's important, I think it's dangerous when we sort of say the banks are evil, right? Because there's really big differences. Okay, so in the United States, the majority of muni bonds issued by municipalities are held by individuals, either as individuals or more likely through bond funds, mutual funds. And these were traditionally marketed these are like widow and orphan investments, right? Supposedly very safe. And so the people that hold municipal bonds are often, they may be residents of the city, employees of the city. The bonds are held by people, and they've made a loan backed by the city's pledge that it will repay the loan, including through the use of the city's taxing power for a general obligation bond, or through the application of a dedicated revenue stream if it's a revenue bond. And so, Is that claim morally inferior, someone who took their retirement savings and loaned it to the city based on the city's promise to repay? Like, I mean, you know, like, much of my many members of my family are public workers, so like I'm not down on pensions in any way, shape, or form. My dad, you know, tier 1, right? A 1956 graduate of Albany Law School, right? But exactly. My sister, a graduate of Albany Law School, also a public employee. But I think, you know, there's a lot of gray here, and I don't think any one stakeholder has a moral high ground in that, you know, that everyone's hurting here. Right? Every single person, like the bondholder whose bond is wiped out. I mean, yeah, obviously it's a much less significant immediate impact than if it's your job and your pension right there. But, you know, I just want to play a little bit of devil's advocate to say that this is tough business to figure out how to share the pain. And I don't envy sitting there looking at the city of Albany's budget saying, how on earth do I employ firefighters, employ police officers, fix the potholes in a northeast climate when, you know, thank God we didn't get 3 feet of snow yesterday. You know, we're all breathing, we're happy that we don't live in Buffalo right now. But I just want to raise, I want to raise the notion that like, it'd be easy if we could say that's a black hat. Like, you know, the unions aren't evil, the bondholders are not evil, the taxpayers are not evil. It's just, this is tough.
Well, here's the beauty behind this, and I'm going to throw this out for your own.
Sorry.
Hey, there was one of the, and it's called, I used to call it the nuclear option for public pensions, but back in 2010, the IRS asked for commentary on whether state plans or municipal pension plans would qualify under ERISA, okay? And it was like the third rail for everybody involved in this game, if you will. You never want the feds to come in and start looking over your shoulder as a pension plan because things get ugly real quick, okay? With Chapter 9 now being invoked against unions or public employees, if you will, do I have to start changing my look as a representative for the best interests of my retirees in invoking federal legislation to bring in all of our public pensions under the umbrella of ERISA oversight? And do I get some sort of insurance protection? Because if somebody's going to come in and go, Chapter 9, what do I have to do to offset that liability? What do I do? Do I go to the federal government and say, you know something? They did it in the private sector, they're doing it now in the public sector, and I want ERISA oversight to make sure that if these people don't contribute their fair share, do they go to the jail like private industry? That's the thing that we should look at, because we're changing the dynamics of the game. And by the way, I can honestly, and on behalf of my friend from the State Comptroller's Office, they qualified, congratulations, as a viable plan under the IRS provisions. But nobody wants to talk about ERISA oversight. Do we need it now?
The Lieutenant Governor might have the answer. Go ahead.
Dying to say something, and that is I have spent the last 10 days defending Rhodes' decision against attacks from everybody I know in the municipal bond world who thought the decision was outrageous because it protected you said earlier, it treated retirees better than it treated unsecured bondholders. But I really think, with all respect to Mr. Mulvaney, that I have to make 3 points. Number one, all of the ERISA, defined benefit ERISA plans that are ostensibly protected by the PBGC are essentially as underfunded as the public pension plans. So the fact that they're subject to ERISA doesn't mean a damn thing, and all you have to do is ask the building trades, and they'd be the first person to tell you that they're in as much trouble as the public unions are on this question. So that's factually incorrect. Second of all, the unions have sponsored in Detroit, where the trustees were union dominated, they paid out 13 months of benefits instead of 12. It's one of the reasons that these 20,000 retirees didn't have a dime. And last of all, I point out, and again, I don't blame my friends in the union movement for using their political clout to get what they wanted. But in addition to what Kathy pointed out quite correctly about all of the pension sweeteners that got passed every session of the legislature and never a word about it in the press, that added enormously to the cost. In addition to that, the union trustees and unions have used their political pressure, and again, I'm not critical of it, but to maintain the use of discount rates of 7.5% and 8% in measuring the adequacy of pension funding, which is absolutely absurd by the standards of anybody that has looked at it. And I know for a fact that they actively pushed for that in New York City's case and in New York State's case. And last of all, what Kathy very benignly pointed out, the ability, the word amortization is disingenuous, it wasn't Kathy's, but the ability to borrow, in other words, make your contributions to the pension fund in the form of promissory notes, which was legislated in 2010, largely at the behest of the public employee unions in New York State. So they have contributed promissory notes bearing a 3.5% coupon when the state continues to use a 7.5% discount rate to measure the adequacy of their pension funding. I mean, what you see here is, and I could express similar rectitude about what the municipal bond industry has done, believe me, but what we don't have is a group of politicians who are willing to understand the consequences of what they do. And I think to accept in the world that we live in today and how critically important it is to maintain the ability of states and cities to use tax-exempt financing, to retain that tax exemption. You know, the Republicans passed in the House a bill that would deny the right of a city and state to issue tax-exempt debt if they didn't measure their pension systems in accordance with the formula that they prescribed. That's pretty dangerous stuff. And I worry about it now that they control both houses. And I don't say that in a partisan sense, but we don't need more pressures and more cost pressures on state and municipal governments at this point. And last, let me say that what is critically important is to understand that basically we made, as a society, and I think I said this before, a set of promises to people who lend us money and people who work for us that we can't afford to keep. And it's not the workers and it's not the holders of the notes, it's the politicians who have been unwilling to take the measure to enable governments to keep their promises.
Well, the situation is going to get so bad that they're going to have to deal with it.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Lieutenant Governor. Let me finish, since we started with Albany, with an Albany question. It's also a Harrisburg question. How much more are major cities that serve as capitals of state governments disadvantaged when the states are largely unwilling to provide support for the services that must be provided to those state governments? That's a loaded question.
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and I think I'd like to reframe it a little bit because the challenge for a city like Albany that is not elastic, so we can't annex ourselves like Columbus sort of annexed its way out of being the state capital, is that we have to sort of shift the paradigm because in the past it was viewed that, you know, Albany got the jobs. So you have all the jobs of state government here, and so Albany has these jobs, so Albany is just fine. And, you know, what happened after the Empire State Plaza was built and you saw a huge outflow of people from the city and you saw disinvestment occurring in some of our most economically challenged neighborhoods and all of the things that you know, have happened that aren't unique to the city of Albany, our ability to respond to those is further challenged by the fact that 60% overall of our property is non-taxable. But then in 1997, a political decision was made to create two different tax rates, a homestead rate for homeowners and a non-homestead rate for businesses, with a view that eventually we would get to one rate. But for a while, we could, you know, kick up the bill for for commercial property owners. And so what that has created is a commercial property tax base that's 80% tax exempt. Right? So you've got 20% of that tax base that is expected to pay, what's the proportion? I just got the proportion. They're expected to pay for over 40% of our levy, even though they don't represent that much of our tax base. So they represent significantly less than 40% of our tax base. So, we sort of got ourselves into this problem, and so we have a structural tax problem, and then we also have a revenue problem. And so, it's really working with the state to recognize that as important as the jobs are, when you look at the city's balance sheet, we have to have a different conversation about how the city balances its budget, because those jobs in our current tax structure are not equating to a sustainable tax base.
Right.
So we don't have a municipal a municipal income tax, for example. So if we had a municipal income tax, I don't know if I'd be sitting here. You would have picked some other mayor, potentially, because our population doubles in size every day. And so now you've aligned this idea of this is a city that is funding this larger infrastructure, but everybody's paying for it.
Right.
So that's really where we have to have that conversation. And it is challenging because as the state capital, we have more than just our population doubling every day with people coming here to work. People come here to protest. People come here to visit. People come here as tourists, and we want to welcome them. We want them to see this as the great city that it is. And so I think in looking at what are we going to do to really truly invest, because jobs alone are not sufficient. Throwing money at cities or paying people more is not sufficient. And I do think that we have to have the political will to step back and say, balancing a budget is not sound fiscal management. You as a family don't say, okay, well, if I spend every penny that I bring in at the end of the year, I'm good. Okay, no, you've got to plan for your retirement. You might want to send a kid to college. You might want to buy a bigger house. You might want to make sure that you've got money to replace the roof on your house. And so I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I think it's having the political will to say we're going to step back and take a longer view, because I am an eternal optimist. I absolutely think that we can fix this. I really do. But it's going to take a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of will, and I have to be joined by other people who are willing to make sacrifices as well as talk about fundamental fairness in how we allocate resources in the state.
Well said. That'll be the final word today. And thanks, everybody. And Ray's going to wrap it up here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists, our moderator, the Lieutenant Governor. We welcome you all to come downstairs to the reception in the West Foyer.